Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Integral Stage, the Salon of the Banned series. I am your host today, Brendan Graham Dempsey, with Layman Pascal joining me to talk about a kind of, I would frame it as sort of a meta Salon of the Banned conversation about these sorts of topics and the sorts of dynamics that go into them, and how we adjudicate the whole process of with whom do we speak? What are the windows of sort of explorable ideas? What's sort of the Overton window, if you will, of these sorts of banned conversations, and hopefully get into some of the things that have been coming up for me a little bit around the whole meta space generally, around ethics and sort of influence, voices that we're listening to and the influences that they have, etc. So anyway, with that sort of teeing us up a little bit, welcome, Layman. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Hi, Brendan. Great to be here. Yeah, those are fantastic. I want to dig into those issues around platforming and gaslighting, and the complementary sets of ethics around information access, and what's promotion and what's access, and who has different responsibilities in which different areas, and cults and authoritarianism and all that kind of stuff. Super juicy, super important. Whatever the answer to all that stuff is, none of us have really found it yet. So we got to dig around in this mess as much as we can.
Sounds good. And yeah, so let's kind of get into that. I would also frame that what is happening here in the Integral Stage with the Salon of the Banned series is sort of an example of trying to figure out the contours of that. And maybe you can talk at some point a little bit about what your experience has been, maybe pushback and the dynamics that the responses, the reception and that sort of a thing, and maybe your own, internal struggles or challenges around this sort of issue. But first, let me set this up in the way that I would kind of come at this issue. You mentioned the cult dynamics element of this. How would I say? There's certainly been a long tradition, I guess you could say, of certain cults and cult dynamics arising, not just in integral spaces, but in spiritual communities more broadly, of course. And from where I'm coming at it, in sort of the metamodern spirituality scene, given the ties with other spiritual communities, including integral, there's sort of, I think, different communities also in some ways trying to negotiate the boundaries of their particular sort of community groups, and trying to assess, well, what makes sense in this space, what doesn't. And so certain figures, Marc Gafni and Andrew Cohen, who have both been on the Integral Stage, are sort of lightning rods for that kind of critique. And now that sort of this metamodern spirituality space is now kind of part of this liminal web network, these voices are kind of coming back into that space or being brought back in. And so there's sort of, again, kind of negotiations about, does this make sense and why and whatnot. So that's one of the elements here that I'd love to dive into, but also just talk more broadly about what it means to be a banned voice, the issues of cancellation, as you talked about. And I would love to get into this topic too, of this Overton window idea, right? Those who aren't kind of familiar with that idea, the Overton window is sort of a political notion of what's sort of beyond the pale of, acceptable debate. And everything that sort of lies within the range of acceptable debate lies inside the Overton window. And so what is sort of beyond the pale in an integral context, in a context where people are trying to be multi-perspectival, taking different views and trying to integrate as much as possible? So one question I have is what does that look like? Another question I have, we obviously don't have to jump into all these right away, but just to throw out, kind of give you the sense of where I'm coming from. Another one is sort of, what does define the space? Is it defined by its integral level of participation, or is it defined by the integration of all levels, if that makes sense, right? So are we thinking about, in the sort of general sense of this community space of meta voices and meta tribe, liminal web sense making, this whole sort of thing, right? People who are really interested in trying to bring together different perspectives, different ways of thinking about it, accepting development, accepting different altitudes and stages and that sort of a thing, and trying to harmoniously integrate those. Yeah, what does that look like then in a community space? Is it is it defined then by the number of diverse stages and ranges and levels and altitudes of people in that space? Or is it more defined by the people who are able to operate from sort of the highest perspective, the integral or metamodern perspective, or beyond, let's say, like people who maybe are aware of development, aware of different levels of engagement. And then it's sort of like, well, how do we then integrate folks who, are just sort of like, it's my way or the highway, everyone's wrong, that sort of dynamic. So anyway, that'd be another question. And then the third throw out question I'll throw here is just how do we deal more generally with toxic and abusive people in the community? What does that mean? What does it look like? What should that look like? How do we think about that? So anyway, that'd be my kitchen sink number.
We
of
only need
questions.
about 12 Hegels to address that set of questions. But hopefully we'll get to a bunch of that stuff. So much of this stuff is about getting balances right, and that's different for different contexts, is my first thought. Like, this is what I would do, is I would go back through each one of those things and like subdivide it into two things, make our problem twice as bad. Like with an Overton window, for example, where does that apply to action and where does it apply to speech? Because those might be very different, right? When we're talking about how you relate to someone, are we talking about how you relate to them outside of the conversation you're having, or how you relate to them inside the conversation you're having? Are we dealing with people who are we expecting to integrate everyone, or are we expecting to favor and focus on people who have high levels of integration? Obviously, it's that second one to some degree, but we don't know where those boundaries are. It's going to be fuzzy. It's going to be experimental. I think I probably said this in my interview with Daniela, is for me, the clarifying question was the extreme example. If Hitler or Ted Bundy had something to say about meta theory, would I sit down with them? Yes, I would. And should not be considered to be an endorsement. What I'm doing is resonating and exploring, but then that can't completely let me off the hook for all ethical considerations, obviously. How do you get the balances right? I asked Ken Wilber, how do we set up a place where people aren't being fragile, but where we're not making it unsafe for them either? And he answered half the question. He just talked about kind of green postmodern reactivity, which is a problem. But that doesn't mean that people who bring those points up don't have something serious they want to say, because we also do have to create pockets, ethoi, where we can favor certain moods. And I think, and maybe I said this with Danielle as well, there's a tendency to think that it's a bigger risk than it is, in two senses. One is, you're going to provide access to someone digitally. It's not like they vanish if you don't provide it. It's still around. It just doesn't have any of your input involved. So the fact that you're providing it's not an all or nothing thing. But at the same time, excluding something isn't all or nothing either, right? You go, well, this person's being really one-sided and dominating positions, or we have some other issue with them, is it okay if we kick them out of our Facebook discussion group about metamodern spirituality? Yeah, that's totally fine. It's not like they die. They just go to their next discussion group. So in some ways, the stakes, and that's one of the things I'm concerned about, we exaggerate, we're hyperbolic about the degree to which providing access or denying access are huge problems in a situation in which there are many kinds of access. Now, we can imagine a future where the access becomes much more controlled, and this is a much more serious decision. But I think we should individually practice trying to feel more free about enabling and disabling in the spaces over which we have experimental creative control. And those decisions will be different for different spaces. And that's partly because of what we're going for in that space, and it's partly because of who's in that space.
So then you wouldn't be suggesting that. I don't get the sense that there's in any way a one-size-fits-all approach to this. It's sort of because I could intuit people critiquing. In fact, I've heard some of this critique as well. Don't ban people, don't block people, don't, it's kind of closed-minded. You're just limited. You're not engaging and all that sort of a thing. And so people critique when you try to establish certain boundaries And I feel like that's part of the challenge here. And there's sort of a sense of that within this space, there's sort of a normative or a right way of doing that. But you're saying that basically, no, integral metamodern spaces, multi-perspectival spaces can approach this issue in different ways. And it doesn't mean that one's sort of failing to live up to some grander, more open-minded, more developed perspective.
Oh, exactly. I think we need to be flexible and diverse and offer as much autonomy to the individual spaces as possible, right? And if one space wants to use that autonomy to be to police things based on their ethical sense of what's happening outside that space, or they want to be a little bit more robust in saying we don't want that kind of talk in this space, that's perfectly viable, right? It's like an artistic creation. You're going for a certain mood. But by the same rights, another space wants to go, hey, we want to throw these doors wide open and take as much risk as we can up to a certain point, then great, right? I think people should have autonomous control over that space. And I think there's a lot of these issues come around like boundaries in general. Right? And I think it's similar in information space as it is personally, that you are afforded the opportunity to take risks and have autonomy if you feel secure in your boundaries, right? So we want people to feel secure in their boundaries to then make the choice about how much enforcement or non-enforcement they want to do. And that's different for different people for a lot of different reasons. Like one of the things in talking with people who might be perceived as dangerous to others, right? I'm willing to talk to a lot of them because I don't feel endangered. And that's not a normative claim that people who do feel endangered are incorrect, right? It's saying that I'm in a circumstance of privilege for a variety of reasons to not feel personally endangered by this circumstance. So my boundary feels secure, I can risk it. If someone else's boundary doesn't feel secure, they don't need to risk it, right? They've got to be working with their own boundary conditions.
Yeah, I think what's so challenging about these spaces, because they're online, they're digital, and that means that it's not like having a conversation with a person one-on-one in a room that I can tailor, the way I'm talking, the way I'm engaging with that person specifically. It's basically I have a megaphone and I'm putting this out into not necessarily the world, but a very large space. And the ability to tailor effectively in that space is what to me is so hard. You brought up, the inside the conversation dynamic versus outside the conversation. And that's a really interesting one too, right? Because it's sort of like, let's say you're talking to Ted Bundy, and within that conversation, you're basically trying to establish a rapport and this sort of a thing, right? And maybe that makes sense in that context, because you also know in the back of your mind all sorts of caveats and things that are important contextually in the situation, et cetera. But then if you just film that conversation and then sort of put it online, it's like, here's Layman Pascal, getting cozy with Ted Bundy. And so it's like all those contextual, situation-specific, interpersonal, dynamic-specific elements are sort of gone, and you've sort of basically projected an image that is, shorn of all that. And so I guess the question is like, how do we navigate that in these online spaces? Because to tie also that in with what you were just saying about people have different comfortability levels or different, they feel safe or unsafe. That might differ for different people and different topics, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, should we sort of plan to create spaces in which there's sort of a minimum sort of level of kind of standard safety everyone can expect to be this safe in this space, so to speak? Or is it everything's sort of more or less permitted and people have to police their own responses? This seems to raise a lot of just logistical challenges, right? I mean, you show up into an online forum or a group that you're in, and let's say you see something that, for lack of a better word, triggers you. You have a trauma related to that. You didn't sign up for that. That this is just, if it's a hodgepodge, you don't really know what you're getting into. So anyway, broader issue there is just that how do we deal with the context specific elements for all these things in an online space that lacks that?
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know the answer completely. No, I don't know if anybody does. I think we're cooperatively generating spaces. Each space has to be judged in its own context. Each space will have things that are too far and things that other people think are too far and that space thinks is fine. trying to be as upfront about that as possible, I think, is important. We've moved toward having these warning labels on the integral stage, trying to say, look, we want to invoke the responsibility of the viewer to some degree, and it's not only the viewer's responsibility. But one of the things going forward that I think is really important is we have to be more proactive as recipients of information, and that our historical situation, which was that, imagine if you only encountered one book in your lifetime or something like that, right? That's a very different situation than when you get 10,000 potentially significant contradictory pieces of information each day, some of them from marketers, some of them from non-humans, and some of them disguised to look like facts that are not facts. That's the situation now. So that requires a much higher degree of individual responsibility. And we have to be careful with that, because it doesn't mean there's no other forms of responsibility and you can just gaslight the individual's reactivity. But nonetheless, we do have to be cultivating a community in which people do take more of that on themselves as the recipient of the information. So that's one of the things. How do we encourage that? And what we can do at the integral stage is sort of be upfront about that, right? I've been trying to regularly say, look, here's what we're doing. This is an exposure and a risk-taking platform. This is not a secure platform, all right? If I have to go around and tell everybody that I would talk to Ted Bundy so that they get the idea, then I'll do that, right? You should know that going in. And then you've got to sample from subtle cues, right? Because there's a lot we don't know about people. There's a lot of dimensions. And there's a question about it. Like in these spaces, we're often dealing with things that are so subtle and post-conventional, or whatever we want to call it, that you couldn't really know from a surface scan. You'd have to watch it a little bit and get your own sense of what the nuances are, right? Because things that would be normally positive or normally negative or normally safe or normally dangerous in conventional discourse might have all kinds of tweaks in this space. And we need to be very clear that the kind of conversations we're having are high tweak spaces. Beyond that, everybody's got to use their own judgment somehow about who they're going to include. And I think, like I said a minute ago, the most important thing to be is to be as consistent and upfront about the tone and the criteria that you're using, so that people know that going in. Because like you said, there's a lot of contextual information that we just can't assume everybody has.
So let me ask you this, because this is really, for me, very important, which, I'm operating in this realm of talking about spirituality. I recognize the integral stage is a little bit broader than that, but obviously that's a very important dynamic or topic as well. And so my question is sort of like, okay, let's say you have Ted Bundy on, but why? Like, what insight are we going to get from Ted Bundy other than some, well, I could make, recipe jokes or something, or, anyway, but like, actually, I know, I'm sorry, I'm confusing him with Jeffrey Dahmer. Anyway, the point is, like, what are we going to be gaining from insight from them, especially on spiritual topics, right? It's,
What lets him through that filter?
Well, even more like, let's say you have a book of spiritual wisdom and there are a bunch of quotes. This one's from, Buddha, Jesus. Oh, this one's from Ted Bundy, right? Yeah. Now, is someone going to latch on to that and be like, yes, Ted Bundy, there was a guy who got it. You know what I mean? There, so,
right. And we could say Manson, because this was the case with Manson, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So that's my basic question. I mean, it's what then justifies asking questions of those folks if they, in some ways, have for lack of a better term, kind of disqualified themselves through their behavior for being viable subjects of inquiry on these topics.
So what would I look for? I would look for, are there a bunch of people in our community? And that doesn't even have to be half, right? Is there just a cohort in the community that I think would be interested? Does this person nominally have a take in the, let's say, developmental metacognition space, right? Is whether they do or not, whether it's competent or not, whether it's useful or not, do they at least have the presumption that they want to make an argument like that, right? So if I hear from 15 people and they're like, we're really interested in what Ted Bundy has to say, And then Ted Bundy sends a message going, I have a lot of things to say about meta-perspectival spirituality. And then in addition to that, I think this is going to be upsetting for some people. That might be good, or it might not. I can't tell, so let's do it. That's sort of my process on those things. I would be looking for those. The nominal suggestion that the person has something to say in the vision logic space, the interest of some members of the community, and the fact that it might be risky or provocative, that's a plus up to a certain point. And so, I don't know what that point is exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so you could also flip this around and be like, there's a bunch of people in our community who want to hear about Ted Bundy. Am I in the right community?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So there's that thing that comes up for me. But also then there's this other dynamic, right? Where it's like, let's say, as my mother used to refer to the sort of generic human being, Joe Schmo from Idaho. Let's say Joe Schmo from Idaho has his thoughts on multi-perspectival theory or whatever.
Yeah.
But no one's ever heard of Joe Schmo from Idaho, but Ted Bundy, everyone's heard of. Why? Because he did something heinous and awful, right? So is there something a bit what's the word, obscene about sort of giving a platform or a microphone to people based solely on being infamous rather than necessarily having intrinsically anything of insight to say about the topic?
There is something obscene about it. And how do we handle that level of obscenity? Because that's the dominant approach in our civilization, right? If we were going to be like, the integral stage is going to interview Ted Bundy, well, Fox News and MSNBC and CNN are doing it too. And he's going to be on Rogan next week or something like that, right? Because culturally, we lean into this kind of obscenity. It's part of the logic of the information systems we have set up. So that's not to excuse it. I mean, it may be that all of that is unforgivably obscene. But I think it's not outside the Overton window of what's socially normative to do that. I also think for us, the best thing we can do, the simplest and most direct integrity move we have at integral stage is the counterbalance maneuver, right? And if somebody says, hey, I was really unhappy with that, I'm like, great, come on and tell me about it.
Or in this case, come on and
exactly
come interview on about it.
But we have a series to talk to Joe Schmo from Idaho if he's got opinions on this. So, right, we go, well, maybe there's something about fame and infamy that makes it interesting. Maybe that's a garbage way to value people, even though we all do it. So we can counterbalance that a little bit by let's talk to just anybody, because the task we gave ourselves, and we've tried to clarify this, is to get all the contours of this space. And it won't all be nice, and it won't all be interesting to everyone. Some will seem awful, some will seem great, some will be right up your alley, some will be like, how are they even in this space? We're trying to cast a very broad net. Now, that's our project. Everybody's going to have a slightly different project, and I would encourage them to really take some time to think about where their integrity is and what their project is, because that can be very different answers for different people. And in a space where we're aware of multi-perspectival, multi-value situations, it's possible that you can clarify a value and the next person for the same reason will clarify what looks like the opposite value. Because, right, up to a certain point, right, there's going to be fractures. There's things that are sort of obviously too much and too dangerous, and that's a little bit different in different cases. But I think our background assumption in the extended liminal web is there is space for seemingly alternate values in this space.
Well, yeah, and that's a good question. It's like when you think about the project of the integral stage, for example, is it in some ways just to map this space, like just almost kind of descriptively, kind of almost objectively, like, oh yeah, here are the people talking about these things? And or is there a sort of value inherent in that of sort of, is there a presumption that, well, if we're operating or claiming to be at least trying to operate from a multi-perspectival integrative perspective, there's going to be value in all of these different perspectives? See what I mean? Like it's sort of like, someone could historically study, who's talking about, I don't know, serial killers or something, right? Other people might say, this is really kind of intrinsically morally important or something like that. Yeah, I think you get what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, this is an ambiguity here within integral theory itself, right? The way it's formulated by a guy like Wilbur is to say there's no untruths. There are only partial truths, but they're not partial in the same degree. So what we would go is, well, okay, there is value to everybody's point of view, but which parts of it are valuable and how do those values stand relative to other values? Now, you may not always need to foreground that point, but I think that's the background context. And I expect to find some kinds of value in every interaction. And then I expect to spend some time pondering where in my value map that goes and how valuable it is and where it's counterbalanced by something I don't find valuable. It is very tricky. And, the project of the integral stage is largely just to map and to make available the results of this map, right? And different parts of the map will resonate with different people. So it's access, it's exposure, and it's mapping. It's also partly what I'm interested in trying, because there's something personal about it as well. And there's an element of, is there a resonance? Is there a hidden resonance network that can be established? And to establish that is easy in some cases, right? If you and I and Joe Lightfoot sit down, it's pretty easy to get into a really beautiful groove and go, this has got to be the heart of the liminal web. There's other places where you're like, God, it's hard to find this one, right? For me, that's an interesting experimental territory. And maybe it's because a person needs 4 hours to get there, or because they're really intellectual, or because there's some creepy thing inside them that when I get close, it feels gross. But I'm willing to try that out because I think it's like you're fishing. You don't know what you're going to find. Mm-hmm. Maybe 9 times out of 10, it's great fish. And one time it's a gross old tire.
Is there, just to wrap this up about the inside versus outside dynamic, when you're interviewing folks, is it sort of a more or less a rule that you're just focused on the interpersonal dynamics of that conversation? Or is there part of you or part of your brain that has this in mind to sort of project something to an audience simultaneously or in contrast, et cetera? Like how do you balance those two dynamics?
I make minimal nods to the audience, right? I mean, we're setting it up, we're making it available. I'm doing a little bit of framing at the beginning, but I want to keep that as low as possible, because for me, I want to show up authentically in 2 ways. And one is just to see what kinds of resonance can be established and to follow my curiosities. And then I will also have a part of my brain that is thinking about what I consider to be the bigger issues, which is I don't want that too contaminated by what I think the audience might feel. I do have to take that a little bit into account, but I worry I don't want to prejudice myself. And so I have these background things, and it's not a news show. I don't want to throw these at people. I don't want to ask them the questions that I think someone else would ask. I want to ask the questions that maybe only I would ask. But where I have concerns, I try to fold that into the question. I'm interested in seeing if I can take people a little bit closer to the thing I want them to see or touch. And then I want to see how they respond to that. So I do a lot of subtle maneuvering based on part of my brain that's background tracking issues outside of the conversation. But my primary focus is on the inside ethics of the discourse in the moment.
Yeah. I want to turn to specifically talk about spirituality and sort of banned voices in that context, and cult dynamics especially. I guess one way to dip into this issue, and again, all this is going to filter and come back and interweave with itself, so we might kind of in the course of this retrod stuff we've already been talking about. I'm sure we will, but there's a critique which I think is very valid, which is that spiritual communities and spiritual spaces have historically been, let's say, how would I put this? Well, anyway, I'm trying to find the most sort of simplistic, kind of charitable way of putting it. But basically, they've been plagued by abusive spiritual teachers, wackos, nut jobs, cult leaders, Heaven's Gate stuff, Kool-Aid drinking, suicide, these sorts of dynamics, right? There's a lot that goes off the rails, and people who are unhinged that gravitate towards these spaces. Some of them wind up finding themselves in positions of power, abusing that power, etc. And given that sort of dynamic, that historically established dynamic within religion and spirituality, I think there are some people, and I'm sort of one of them, who would say, all right, you know what? Given that, it's sort of like, let's try to just not do any of that. Let's try really hard to avoid all of that. And if it means that we have to kind of cast too wide of a net sometimes, maybe it's worth it. It's sort of like, it's just, if that's sort of the reputation, you're trying to counter that because you feel like there's a gem at the heart of the spiritual traditions that's been so, corroded or just dirtied by all the other things that have been done in the name of religion and spirituality. I feel like it can be salutary to basically just say, none of that. So what would be your sort of thought about the potential harm that it might do to spiritual communities, especially fledgling ones, by engaging like known cult leaders and sort of problematic voices? Does that question make sense? I could rephrase it or try to make it more concise.
There's several questions in it, I think. Let me throw a few things back and then we'll see if it requires clarification. We do need to be careful, and it's not clear to me entirely whether spiritual communities are uniquely plagued by these things compared to other affairs. Democratic Western governments are raining death on people from the skies on a daily basis. Are we implicated in that because we vote? Maybe. So there have been these problems in spiritual communities, and our goal is not necessarily to say whether spiritual communities are good and bad or dangerous or safe, but to say how could we make them better. Carter Phipps, who was one of Andrew Cohen's senior students, he and I discussed writing a book called The Integral Guru Handbook a few years ago. And what would go into a book like that? Interesting question, right?
Indeed.
It's got to have some principles by which leaders, teachers, and transmitters comport themselves in ways that respect other people, establish more intelligent interpersonal social protocols, and set themselves up well for the future. It's also got to have a wisdom for individuals about how to act with more security and autonomy and self-esteem and self-respect in those situations to get more of what they want and less of what they don't want. There has to be some wisdom about how you deal with complaints and disruptions and trauma and upset, both real and unreal, going forward. And then there has to be maybe some dynamics on how the actual thing you're hoping to get done, whether that's a teaching or a subtle transmission of some kind, are there ways to do that more effectively, more efficiently? All right. So all of these things are, I think, open questions. They're all areas where we need to get better and develop a shared open wisdom dialogue about how to comport ourselves in these spaces, no matter which part of the space we're occupying at any given moment. Now, I think there's a lot of room for more caution than we've historically exhibited, but also we still want these spaces to be free and experimental. We also want them to be to grow in their anti-fragility as well as growing in their caution. And we need to be, like we are with any other human area, aware that there's messiness and aware that people are meeting themselves in weird places, and not be shocked by that, but not allow it to contaminate everything else. Like if people come together in an S&M scenario, all right, and one of them wants to play dominator and one of them wants to play submissive, maybe that's fine, right? And maybe that's fine even in a spiritual community, as long as we know that's what's happening, right? As long as you're not just, I'm the nicest, goodest, most enlightened person in the world and I'm secretly abusing people or whatever it is, right? The first thing is, can we establish a space in which we understand what human beings are like, understand why we've come together in this community, and are more upfront about the different dynamics that are in play, rather than trying to submerge that behind a conventional social facade of authoritative positivity, which almost always conceals crimes.
Yeah, I assume I kind of already know the answer to this, but just to try to home in on the initial question I was getting at, of sort of like, if you think about like if politicians say maybe have especially maybe if you're in a country that is particularly corrupt and they have a reputation for being corrupt and taking bribes and this sort of a thing, right? It's probably not a good idea for a politician to be driving around in a Rolls Royce with, big shades on and just like, heading to a mansion with a big swimming pool, right? Like that's sort of like I mean, even if nothing is going askew there, maybe that guy just inherited, money or something like that, or won the lottery, who knows? But it's just sort of like sets people on edge. Or similarly, I mean, this goes all the way back to Plato, and the sophists, where basically it's like people charging money for their wisdom was sort of like, it made people uncomfortable. It was sort of like a knock against you. It's like, well, and that was one of the things that, Socrates was like, look, I'm not charging anyone any money for this, right? So like there are those elements where like money starts getting involved and these sorts of dynamics come into play, that it can be easier to just like avoid all that. And I guess I'm kind of using that sort of as an example to be like, given the reputation of spirituality for having these problems, does it do us any good to quote unquote platform actual cult leaders, and people who have been engaged in cult-like behavior in actually the integral, or in, I don't want to say the integral space specifically, but certainly, adjacent to that space, at least? That's sort of but again, I think you more or less did answer it. I wanted to articulate that point a little bit clearer.
Yeah, I mean, does it do us any good is an interesting question, right? And there's the way I would ideally like these things to be run, and there's the way they've mostly always been run, and there's the sort of in-between area right now where we're trying to experiment with how these things go. I think it does do us some good. I think the reason people are adjacent to integral or adjacent to metamodern spaces is because they have something going on that is of interest to us, right? It doesn't mean everything they're doing is of interest to us. Doesn't mean we don't have serious criticisms. Doesn't mean we know everything about the situation. But one of the reasons is that they're attracted to it, and they're probably attracted to something that we're also attracted to. And we should be curious about that. Doesn't mean we have to indulge that curiosity in every case, but there is a reason to have these discussions. And in addition to that kind of reasoning, I think it's just the anti-fragile hygiene going forward strikes me as very important. I said this with Danielle, like I want to be very clear that if people are prioritizing a particular ethical response to incoming content, that's good. Right? That's not a problem with them. We shouldn't be gaslighting them for that, right? If the main thing they're seeing is this is an awful person, or I can't be a part of this, or this is too much like something that happened to me. Okay, good. Don't watch this. That's not the wrong response. That's a fine response. But there are other sets of ethical concerns as well. And one of those concerns, which is practical as well as ethical, is how are we going to live in the information hyper universe? Because you say, well, maybe it doesn't look good for that politician to be driving around in that Rolls Royce with those shades on. But we're entering a space, and maybe we're already in it, where there's no way to look good to everyone, right? You could be Mother Teresa, and you're going to get 30 irate denunciations of how you're a fascist every day, just because the whole world has the device at their fingertips. There isn't going to be a way, and I think this is one of the problems that Integral faced early on, is it tried to be too American, too commercial, too clean, right? And that sets you up, you look even worse when something goes wrong, and it will go wrong. But also that's a fragile place to be, right? It doesn't reflect the realities of the information universe. It's like my band wants to put all their songs online, but are we going to make sure nobody says anything bad in the YouTube comments? Right? That's exhausting and pointless. So the question is, where do you go after that? If you go, that's going to be the reality more and more going forward. So how do we withstand that? How do we exist in a relatively stable boat on seas that are going to be choppy in that respect? How do we, even if possible, gain something for ourselves and for the community from that turbulence at the edges? And I think it's important to lean into those things, right? It's one of the reasons risk-taking is part of the integral stages idea of itself, is you're not going to get out of this clean, right? Even if we did everything everybody wanted, we're going to get shit thrown at us. We might as well push into territory that feels a little dangerous to us, so we can at least try to develop the skills and the robustness to handle that, because our idea is the future contains more of that no matter what you do.
Sure. Well, then, so what is that Overton window, right? I remember not too long ago, Emil Fries was drawing attention to the, was it Go for Change, some cult that was using developmental theory in really culty ways, right? And I know that you guys did a segment talking about it and that sort of a thing. But like, I guess the question is, would you have them on? That might be one example, but
Sure.
More broadly, it's sort of like, are there folks who you would not have on because, I don't know, that would be sort of the question.
Yeah, there's a boundary. I don't know what that boundary is exactly. I can make some guesses. I don't run into it a lot because my boundary is maybe more expansive than a lot of people's boundary, but that doesn't mean there's no boundary. The Go and Change people, yeah, I would talk to them because I would be curious, right? And I would, there might be, maybe in my mind, I'm having that interview, I'm thinking, yeah, you guys have some sinister thing going on behind your eyes. And I would be curious to see if any of my questions reach any of those places, because I think we're in a better position if we can see what's going on. And sometimes that means looking at things that are dangerous or ugly or whatever. We're not just going to only look at the things that are nice and that we support, right? If it's potentially a problem, then it's even more important to have a look at it. And I think having a look at it doesn't just mean doing the reporter on the White House steps, Senator, how do you feel about being terrible? That kind of thing, right? It's not just about calling people out with the idea that somehow calling them out holds them accountable. I think it's about probing to see what's there so that we, and me too, like, I want to know what's going on with this person. This is a weird fish under the ocean. Where does it have spikes? Is it camouflaged? Does it have unexpectedly delicious eggs? I don't know. I've got to probe. Now, there is some kind of boundary. In fact, there's several kinds of boundaries, right? Inside and outside ethics. Inside ethics, yeah, if I can't have a conversation with you, if I come away feeling like shit, if I feel like we're not getting anywhere all the time, if I feel like you're not a good faith actor in the discussion, yeah, then that can quickly reach a boundary. Right now, I'm flexible. I can go further than a lot of people can go in those conversations, but there'll be a point. There's people in my life I don't talk to anymore. And there are, I was thinking about movies, right? Like I'll watch a movie because I think it's going to upset me. It's interesting. I've always been like that. But sometimes I'll see a movie and I go, I can't watch this. It's just so relentlessly nihilistic and awful. It seems like it's contaminating me just by its existence. It doesn't happen very often, but it's happened once in a while. And I will turn it off. I've got a threshold. I can't say in advance what that threshold is going to be, because if I say I would talk to Ted Bundy, then the threshold isn't, I have factual information this person has committed crimes. That's not the threshold for me. It's something subtler than that, but it is there. And I don't know, maybe there's better ways for me to handle that, but that's my instinctive response.
Yeah. Let's say, like, thought experiment here, and actually maybe this has even come up in real life, but like, let's say there's a spiritual thinker out there who, they've done something very bad. They've sexually abused people. And that's on record. That's pretty uncontested. In fact, there are people, let's say I'm a person and I say, this person did this to me.
Yeah.
Layman Pascal, how can you go and talk to this person, put them on your show and do all this that sort of gives this person further reach into people's lives in a way that seems inappropriate? Now, even as I ask this question, a lot of what you've been saying is filtering through my head, and I can begin to kind of anticipate, the answer. So in some ways, maybe it's a moot point because we've kind of covered this terrain. But I wanted to somehow make it super personal, less abstract, like when I guess the question maybe is like, what are the ethical responsibilities we've had to the people who've been hurt by these terrible people? Is there something almost insensitive or voyeuristic isn't the right word, but the ability to sort of be like, oh yeah, this person did something heinous and terrible and robbed this person of, a full healthy life, but we'd love to hear what they have to say about meta theory. You know what I mean? Like there's something, again, sort of potentially obscene there. So I don't know. Again,
there's a perverseness to that for sure. And I don't know if there's a clean way around that, right? So in that scenario you're describing, one of the things I would do is, first of all, I want to reach out to that person. Okay, tell me about it. I don't know if you're willing or not, but come on the show and talk about it. We would be happy to do that. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you don't want to be that exposed. Maybe we can just have a private conversation. And I can't guarantee that's going to change how I think about doing things going forward. But I can say to you, I will take that in and it will go into my mix because these are serious things. But we're dealing with mixed constituencies, right? There's going to be people who contest all the facts going forward. There's going to be people who say, I want to hear from this person and I don't think they did it. I want to hear from this person and I do think they did it. I never want to hear from this person. I only want to hear from this person if what they're doing is apologizing for having done it, right? And so there's a mixed set of constituencies, and we're not serving any one set of concerns on this. So we can't make our decisions based on any one set of concerns. Even if we take that concern seriously and believe it's true, that's not the overriding decision maker for all these things. But that means it's going to come up in ways that are perverse, right? And we need to be aware of that and upfront about that, right? And let's put warning labels on the whole thing. This might be perverse indulgence. So all of that. And then at the same time, I think we have a responsibility to question our personal and social concern about people infiltrating, people being given credibility, people getting in. There's a certain dreamlike, subtle energy quality to that, which doesn't mean it's not real, but to be good shamans, we have to be able to handle that in some way and not just be like, oh my God, we can't expose ourselves to the dark magic because it will become credible. And if it becomes credible, it will spread. There's a dangerous way of thinking that says, like, basically, if you make gay marriage legal and then it's officially stamped, it's gotten in, we're all going to have to get gay married. That's the end of everything God wanted us to do, right? There's this sort of sense that if you acknowledge something, that you're allowing it to gain territory at the expense of other serious values and concerns. And I don't think that's the case. And even if it is the case to some degree, it's not good for us to act like it's the case. We need to build up our ability to handle that and our ability to ward off and dance around and be uncontaminated by dangerous things. And not everybody's going to be in a position to do that at any given time. So we have to encourage each other to exercise responsibility in receiving information that doesn't again, like, I don't know. I'm making an argument that comes from what I think is the right thing to do, but you could easily read that argument as excusing me from anything. Maybe I'm letting myself off every hook.
No, it's been, well, for my part anyway. I mean, I very much am sympathetic to the whole endeavor. I think I think also that these kinds of conversations are really good too, because it's sort of like, it really helps to know, not that these things haven't been discussed and talked about in other contexts before, but just to have it very clear, like the shared understanding of what the space is, what's it doing, what are its aims, and even just the fact that it's sort of owning an awareness of all of the potential problems and uncertainties and maybe vexed ethical issues around all this is, I think, really important. So, I'm heartened to hear you say, which I agree with as well, that different people are going to navigate these issues differently. Different spaces are going to navigate them differently. Even, the same person might recognize, oh, this space might be more appropriate to take bigger risks and to have a wider window, and this space isn't. But at the same time, I'm there's sort of a pedagogical element in all of this. A lot of the way that you talk, sort of, you're definitely challenging folks to be inhabiting the world the way more that it should be, right? Which is that we should be better at sort of auto adjudicating, the information that we're receiving and being able to kind of take responsibility for that, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's a question of like, well, that might be ideal, but is that the reality? Like, are people doing that? And you can operate from a space of, well, let's aim at the ideal, and then we can kind of bring people along into it. But of course, then you're also at risk of sort of just leaving a bunch of people behind or potentially causing confusion. I mean, I said pedagogical because I think of like, imagine an 8th grade class where the teacher thinks, well, these kids are ultimately going to need to learn calculus. So why don't we just do it now, and throw some calculus out there and just, trash this 8th grade math book and jump into the real stuff, right? Like, it's almost interesting because in a community that's so developmentally aware, it's like we should be at least aware that different people are going to be engaging with the material in different ways, and not all of them are going to be that ideal way that you're talking about. So that needs to be folded into the mix as well. And I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely. I'm negotiating what I think is the normativity for myself and for others. And the understanding is we're not all going to be there. In fact, almost none of us are going to be there most of the time. That doesn't mean you don't try. And each of the different contexts will be sort of proposing its own implicit normative thing that most people won't really be able to do. I think of it a bit like, it's like an exercise station or a gym or something like that, right? You got your 200-pound weights. It doesn't mean you expect everyone to be able to lift the 200-pound weights. There are also 20-pound weights, right? So you might go, well, hey, don't push yourself to the point you're going to get a hernia. Go work on something that's less intense for you right now. There are other videos. We're trying to organize ours in series, so you don't even have to see all the same kind of stuff, right? There's a label. It says who's going to be in it. It says what kind of themes are going to be involved. And this is the same as all normal media, right? Like, hey, you're watching Netflix and it's this will contain nudity, violence, smoking. Are you prepared for that? Otherwise, don't watch this, because somebody made this and it may contain a bunch of things that you find distressing.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, if I don't interrupt, but let me ask you this though. So when these things get shared in different contexts, because obviously this is kind of how this happens, these things get created and then sort of dispersed throughout all these different groups and whatnot. So whenever like a video about Andrew Cohen or Marc Gafni shows up in the Metamodern spirituality group, I always add some contextual information, right? Of like, here's something that anyone I think watching this should know about, because as you've mentioned too, you're engaging folks in these conversations in an inside context. You're kind of engaging them one-on-one. You're not like, hey, remember that whole scandal that you experienced? Like, let's talk about it, right? So people tuning into your conversations with folks might not necessarily know anything about any of that. And again, this kind of brings in what I kind of was starting to frame the initial conversation with, is that some people are showing up into these metamodern spaces who they don't know who those folks are. The information isn't even there. And so I guess my question for you is, well, to finish the setup here. So when I do that, I'll put almost like a little Surgeon General's warning, sort of, again, kind of like what you're saying, a little warning, but in this case, in the comment thread. But some people might see that as I'm canceling this person, right? I'm shutting it down. Or that I'm chaining them, I'm shackling them to who they were in the past unfairly and not allowing them to show that they've changed and developed, et cetera. What are your thoughts about a practice like that?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I hear from these people, and some of them have these opinions about you or other people. And I think it's by and large good, right? Like if a person feels it incumbent upon themselves to have an introductory reminder to these are the issues said to be around this person, yeah, by all means, bring that up, especially if you're doing it in a balanced, constructive way. Now, you got to ask yourself questions about that. Like, am I doing it reactively? Am I fixating on stories I've heard that trap a certain person in a previous aspect of their persona and ignore that they might have changed, or ignore that maybe all that stuff I heard was really from a biased perspective of some kind? So you got to confront that stuff, but you confront it, you try to work it in, and then you try to present the most balanced thing you can present in that context. And there's certainly, I mean, everything I've been saying about we're going forward into a world where you have to expect people to be upset. I mean, the fact that somebody wants to append in a comment, there's also these notable issues. Yeah, we have to anticipate that and lean into it to some degree. Now, not everybody's comfortable with that, especially if they're on a side or feel defensive or working with someone, and especially if that work is has a professional element where they have a reputation to defend in order for their livelihoods and their families and everything to function. My approach would be to be much more open to these things, right? I always thought, just call yourself a cult leader. Then you got nothing to lose. People can only agree with you or be enchanted to discover that you aren't one. Right. So there's
that's
a way,
an exciting
to embrace this stuff more, right? If I was running a commune, I would be like, Brendan, come out here every time I say something and tell people what the problems with me are.
I like the idea of a sincerely ironic cult leader who just totally owns it, and then it's like, oh, okay. It's that, yeah.
It gets a LARPing element at that point.
Yeah.
But there's a hidden LARPing element to all of this stuff. It's just that sometimes LARPing leads people to real trauma.
Indeed. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of the territory I wanted to cover. Is there anything like what element of this topic broadly, conceived, do you feel like we haven't yet touched on or would like to go deeper into?
Well, two areas leap out at me as like ongoing concerns, part of my moral passions, right? One of them is how do we take people seriously, right? Because in all this stuff, it's easy to, even if I say it, am I seriously incorporating the voices of victimized people adequately? All right. Am I participating in a culture that gaslights them or treats them as inconveniences or something like that? That bothers me. All right. And it's not a black or white issue, but it's an area I want to probe more because I have concerns there. The other one is the general, and I've touched on this several times, but the general ethics of dealing with information going forward. I say this in lots of interviews, but like when I think about our kids and an information universe that's completely unreliable, that's different than a world in which you learn some facts about people and those are good facts or bad facts, and now we know that about them. Because as true as that is, right, people do commit crimes and we have to keep an eye on certain people, but we're shifting to a place where you can't trust any of the information, right, where documented evidence isn't going to be real evidence anymore. So how do I train people to be safe in a world where nothing they see can be relied upon? And if they believe any of it, they're opening up a Pandora's box, right? And that you can't live like that, distrusting everything, but you're going to have to distrust almost everything to survive the 21st century. How do you do that how do you be constantly omni-suspicious with a good conscience, right? How do you understand that, we've got a 14-year-old girl. What's she going to do? Is she going on dates? Is her date using hypnotic manipulation techniques? Is he spritzing himself with a spray that has oxytocin in it to hack her brain system so she feels more comfortable with him than she actually is? These are real concerns that I have. And they're concerns for a universe of hackability that we're already sliding into, which means the concerns about who's right and who's wrong and who's dangerous and who's safe, they're still real, but they're being overshadowed by this tidal wave of, to me, a much bigger problem of, I just don't know how we're going to build the skills to handle a totally unreliable information universe.
Yeah, it's interesting because I almost feel like a lot of the postmodern skepticism came out of a kind of botched attempt to deal with some of these issues, right? It's sort of, once you realize, the system, they could be lying to me. They probably are, cui bono and all that stuff, you're like, now you're tuned in. But rather than that leading to a bunch of like really critical thinkers, actually investigating and thinking for themselves, it just led to this sort of conformist, critical, conspiratorial thinking of like, whatever the official narrative is, we know that that's not true, but let me tell you why the lizard people are actually working with, and then it's like, So it's that is going to be a huge challenge, because we can say all we want. We can talk about critical thinking and skeptical interrogation, but that can very quickly sort of devolve into this performative thing. This kind of, oh yeah, well I'm not one of the sheeple, right? I mean, we see all this that's kind of blown up, and I don't know. I mean, that's an educational, pedagogical, social issue that there isn't really a silver bullet for. But anyway,
no, it's sort of like, if I know for a fact that CNN is manipulating the truth, does that give me carte blanche to believe whatever Trump is saying? And people do respond like that. Like, if the mainstream is exposed to be biased, then the alternative is something you can double down on, or whatever you were half sensibly intuiting, you can just double down on that, right? We need to extend the critique much further. We have to assume that the alternative story is part of the same manipulation structure as the mainstream story. They both have their virtues and their disadvantages. One thing, I mean, I know I just raised two sets of ethical concerns, but another thing, and I'd be curious about your take on this, is how you view the guru transmitter satsang environment in general, right? Because when we look at authoritarian structures and a lot of these problems, some of them can be separated from some function if we take that function seriously. If we don't, then maybe it's all contaminated, or maybe there's something about certain distorted and dangerous social structures that are intrinsic to doing some function that we do want to have happen. So there's a real mess there, and everybody feels different and has had different experiences on this front.
Yeah, that was actually something I was going to ask you as well, because it's sort of like in the guru dynamic, is there something intrinsically, how would you say? I mean, problematic doesn't quite cover it, but so one of the thoughts that I was having, I watched that Andrew Cohen 3-part documentary series that the BBC did, and he had a guru, and that was the context in which he talked about receiving his sort of insider transmission and whatnot. But then bringing that to America and having that change of context, it's got me thinking a lot about, okay, well, could there be a context, right? Let's say there's an ashram and there are, devoted acolytes or people that are there who are after this thing, and they've all shown up, and this is their guru. And for the record, I mean, my understanding of this is that that guru relationship, it means that whatever they say, you are obliged to, you have to do it. It's just like, that's what you're signing up for with a guru. It's not like a pastor who can pastor you, or, some kind of spiritual guide who can help you. It's like, I am now your master and you have to do what I say. So you're signing up for that relationship. And I'm not beyond the idea that, like, in certain contexts, especially kind of particular social, cultural contexts, that might work. One of the questions, though, is that inherently a pre-modern, kind of setup? Is there something about the introduction of modern thinking and then critical reflection, let alone postmodern critical interrogation of things, that just totally doesn't allow for that as a possibility anymore? So it's one of those things, right? It's like, for me personally, I'm not inclined to seek for my spiritual fulfillment by going to a church and doing particular ritual sacraments and then ingesting something and then believing that, this had a magical impact on me, etc. But I can also appreciate that, like, that works for many people. And if you want to use kind of an amber blue way of framing that, like that works well, or even purple in that sense, or magenta, whatever. So it's not, there's a difference between sort of authoritarian power structures potentially used in a benevolent way that works socioculturally and psychoculturally, and there are ways in which those very structures then become pathological once the social context is shifted, or once the individual psychic construct is shifted, right? So it's an interesting idea to kind of entertain the idea that authoritarianism at a certain level, right, in certain ways might work, but it's a different question to ask, well, does any of that work in metamodern spirituality, right? I mean, like that, then for me, then it's pathological. If you have sort of assigned, your total control over to someone else, that's deeply problematic to me. But it's a really interesting topic, and I don't have enough experience with a guru relationship to be able to speak intelligently to it. I'm only dealing it with, in the abstract. So, but it could be an interesting thing to talk about. What would? Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of potentially working on a book on this topic. What would an integral or a metamodern guru relationship look like? And I feel like it's interesting once you start building in all those caveats and those rules. Yeah. To what degree have you sort of fundamentally undermine the very idea, sort of?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you've seen any of we have the Fire from Heaven series on Integral Stage, which is specifically about transmission, right? So it gets into a lot of these. And there are certain questions I come to in talking to guru transmitters, which is different than, everybody takes on some of the qualities of the people they're around. There's a transmitter, receiver, creative exchange. Everybody's quality of being and their knowledge gets conveyed to the people around them. And then there's teachers who try to output information on purpose. And then there's this other thing, right, where I'm going to perform the guru function. That function it's uncertain the degree to which it's associated with its classical forms. So here's one of the questions I frequently ask people is, do you think this function, if we take it seriously, is more effective if the guru takes a role similar to the template we associate with the guru? Like, let's say you have in your DNA, just like you have the blueprint for how your hair is going to look like in 30 years. You have an image distributed through your DNA, which is a picture of you up at the degree of the divine human. And that template is activated by your intimate, energized engagement with a figure who resembles that. If that's the case, then you want the Adi-Da performance. You want him up on a throne saying he's the sole universal avatar with beads around his neck, because that's triggering the archetype that triggers your personal transformation journey along that track. So that's one argument. Now, Daw's former student, Samuel Bonder, who is doing this stuff, but doesn't have any of these accusations really leveled against him, tried to do a democratic version of it. He's tried to have like integral auditing of how it goes down in his community, has done a lot of interesting things. I think constantly showing up with his wife creates a certain sensibility to it. But Samuel's view is, whenever possible, sit lower than your students. Whenever possible, presence all the broken zones, green light all your broken zones, part of the waking down thing. Show yourself in your humanity. And that facilitates the direct person-to-person transmission more effectively and more appropriately to a form of society that's moved on from traditional authoritarian hierarchies.
Yeah.
So those are two good, and I hear different answers from different people. There's two good arguments there.
Yeah, I would say though, it's interesting because, as you said, right, like if it's activating your kind of higher potential precisely because your image of your higher potential is that, I feel like that speaks much more arguably about the person than necessarily what that archetype is, if that makes sense, right? Like, because really what you're doing is you're finding a projection. And you're sort of you're playing into that in some ways in order to almost then withdraw again that projection into yourself or something like that. But that would be the question, right? Would be like, if I were to think about my highest divine self, I don't think I would imagine myself like on a golden throne and with this sort of thing, right? It starts to get into your very conceptions of what is sacred and what's profound and what's beautiful. And it's also really interesting. And here's where I think becomes so problematic, right? Is because the God relationship is a projection relationship. It's an I, thou, other. It's a second person sort of thing. And you're projecting, yes, a lot of this sacred, sublime, magnificent sort of aura onto that thing. But it works because it's a projection. I think once you then withdraw the projection and then try to live from that, then it almost becomes potentially, well, at the very least, very problematic, right? Because it's sort of like the difference between, having a relationship with an icon or a divinity that you can bow to and say, like worship and all that. That there's something intrinsically, I would say, spiritual about those sorts of activities. If you don robes and walk around saying, I am God, I am great, everyone worship me, then there's been sort of a translation error there. It's sort of like, which anyway, again, this is a fascinating thing to think about, because we should be withdrawing the projections, I would say. But I think that maybe the problem here would be that we're getting stuck on a particular form that projection's taking, right? And not allowing that to keep evolving. Because once you withdraw the projection, that projection should then shift, if that makes sense.
That's right. And the thing is that it's an organic process. So assume that's the process, right? It's still an organic thing that can't be mandated. So one person is going to take 15 years to do that. Another person is going to take 5 days to do that. And there's going to be all kinds of different elements to that. So setting that up, there's a danger to doing it via the projection model. But at the same time, it's dangerous to do, you see those guys jump off the mountain in those suits where they fly around. Holy shit, looks exciting. I'm not sure I want to try that. But I'm glad the opportunity is available, because when it works, it seems like one of the pinnacles of human experience.
That's interesting. I'm also reminded, by the way, speaking of metamodern gurus, there's a great documentary called Kumare. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I highly recommend it. It's basically someone who affects the pretense of the guru figure. I think he's just, he's a native Californian, but he, takes on this sort of Indian accent and everything and wears the robes and has a following. And then people sort of, pledge them. And he's sort of doing this. He starts out sort of trying to show how, in his mind, originally, he thinks this is a very silly, ridiculous idea that people, give away their self-autonomy and this sort of a thing. And so, if I'm recalling correctly, so he does this as sort of a performance to reveal some of these dynamics. But then people have very real, genuine, profound spiritual change that occurs from this relationship. And by the end of the film, he sort of reconsidered the whole thing. And I think that there's and then the most, I think, kind of metamodern part of all this is that then he does tell his students, he's like, look, he drops the accent. He's like, look, none of this is real. He loses a lot of them, but some of them stay. And they're like, yeah, okay, that's okay, right? I love that. That makes sense to me. So
yeah, we do need to get to a place like that. There's different arguments about what's going on, right? So maybe we're co-creating something as a form of play. And then if we understood that, then there's smarter and more ethical ways to do that. Maybe there's something in the actual biophysics of some kind of mutation that goes on and has to pass by contagion to other people. That's a very interesting option, right? It's anciently affirmed. It's really worth considering if one of your high priorities in life is radical existential change. That's one of the classic arguments about how that occurs. So people should look into that. But obviously, there's an element of interpersonal social role playing. And that's not bad. We do it all the time. Let's get together and dress up as medieval knights, or, right? People do courting routines. And a cynic is going to be like, why are you taking her flowers? That doesn't do anything. Well, it does something. It creates a play that you're doing together. And one of the most interesting things is the anti-guru, right? So Kumar is an example of one. Krishnamurti famously raised to be the world teacher, and then became real grumpy about it. I'm not anybody's guru. And then one of his disciples was Yuji Krishnamurti, who went even further in just denouncing the guru system, but continuing to function as one. People are going to be in his presence to listen to his dharma about no gurus and to receive his presence. So there's a function there, and your attitude about the function is not necessarily pertinent to the function. It's not the same as being wise. It's a special function, and it can be done by people who don't think they're doing it. It can be done by people who are against it. Some people are in the position and they don't seem to be able to do it. So there's a lot of interesting variability there.
Well, and that was another thing that was really striking and interesting to me as another topic that I find very compelling about all this, which is that, you could look at the whole Andrew Cohen situation, and for my money, cult leader, did the whole thing. Whether or not he's changed his tune and has really, a different person, all that is up for different people to assess. But certainly, what was going on for a long time had a lot of problems, which even he acknowledged, right? So, really bad stuff happening, and yet I wouldn't argue that like these, his followers were having profound spiritual insights and awakening experiences, right? And I would even go so far as to say that I think that related to him as a person, right? Which then raises all these really kind of uncomfortable questions, right? Which is, how can it be that some people who are able to, for whatever reason, transmit these profound, or at least occasion for other people, these profound spiritual experiences and awakenings, how can they be so deeply flawed? And I mean, it's interesting too, because this is also something that integral theory in some ways attempts to address, or arguably does. And yet in these integral spaces, as many people have pointed out, that the knowing about how and why that is the case doesn't necessarily stop it from happening. So anyway, just the idea that that someone could be so charged with a potential spiritual power and yet be an awful person, potentially, right? And so what does that mean, and how do we understand that? Raises some big issues.
Yes, it does. It raises huge issues, right? And so the minimum expectation we have in metamodern integral spirituality is that we can surface these questions, that we're not blind to them. We don't necessarily know the answers. The classic integral argument is different developmental intelligences. Right? It turned out, we want to say, this is a Ken Wilber, right? Just because a guy's awesome at basketball shouldn't make you think he knows about nutrition, or that he's a safe person to get drunk and go home with. But at the same time, as human beings, we do tend to make generalized assessments of each other. And that's amplified. I think I mentioned this in the conversation with Daniela. Our technology amplifies this problem, because scanning something for a thumbs up or thumbs down, which is the addiction routine in Facebook, for example, that exaggerates our inbuilt human tendency to make generalized positive or negative valence assessments, which conceal the knowledge we already have that people are different in different aspects of their lives. Right? The Cosby thing is like that. You're like, wow, this guy's entertaining and funny and helped Black people move forward. How could he be a rapist? You're like, well, there should be no shock there, right? It shouldn't be surprising. And yet it is, because as human beings, we like to do these positively or negatively valence packagings of personas.
Yeah.
And it's a real weakness, right? We're all at danger. We're in danger from doing that.
I think that there are two major reasons why we tend to do that. And I think one of them we get from kind of the Christian tradition, or Judeo-Christian, or something of that monotheistic religion. So in sort of this traditional heritage. And then two, I think, comes from modernity, which is, so what I think we get from the Christian tradition is the idea that sacred power resides in a moral being, so that if you are given sacred power, you've inherently gotten the okay from the moral being. So sacred power is tied to morality. And I don't think that is the case always in other traditions that view it much more like, no, this is just, you do the thing, and it's kind of like an experiment. It's like science. If you do all the right things, you're going to get a certain result. And so that way, the lens that we view it through from Christianity, I think, taints that a little bit. And then the way from modernity, I think, is totally different. But it's sort of like, okay, well, if we're all just sort of egos, and our mind is contained in our body, basically, and whatever we've been doing, spiritually, is really just a kind of cultural phenomenon that we're, all kind of, it ultimately kind of goes back to the psychology, really, is what the root of it is. Then you're sort of like, well, if someone is really powerful spiritually, you would think that would mean that they're sort of really powerful psychologically. So then when people have these deep psychological pathologies, it's like, well, that doesn't really match up either. So it almost forces a different paradigm of thinking about these things more objectively, really, as like, these are forces, these are powers, these are realities of the world, to varying degrees that we do or don't understand, potentially. And so conflating that with psychology or morality is just not a good thing. A doctor can have a brilliant insight about a cure or something. That doesn't mean he's going to be a nice person. So anyway, that's just a thought that occurs to me.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things on my mind, and that's definitely one of them, right? And there's something, you could make an argument that the Judeo-Christian tradition and modernity are somewhat starved of the full experience of human complexity. There may be
one could argue
one could argue this, right? And it's not the only way to explain it, but you could. So there are certainly an intelligent pagan would make the argument that there's something insufficient about the organismic complexity of people who live under these conditions, and as a result, they don't anticipate that the human animal is what the human animal is, right? And in the traditional way, in the Christian way, we might say that it takes the form of the avataric embodiment of normativity. If it's the absolute and I've connected with the absolute thing and the absolute is absolutely good, then I'm absolutely good. And then in modernity, it can take the form of psychology, but it can also take the form of reputational dynamics, right? And one of the reasons that marketing is to promote a positive image. And you're supposed to professionally argue your positive image so that other people will be manipulated into a sales routine with you. And it's absolutely practical, but it's also extremely dangerous. And if we need to get past that, we've got to start, at least in principle, risking our reputation, leaning into some kind of anti-marketing dynamic. Because as long as we continue to promote the idea that I'm special and I'm good and I only have your well-being at heart, and here's some wisdom that will really help your life, then you're no better than Colgate or Doritos.
Except with the difference, though, is that in your case, for example, I do trust that you have people's good interest in heart. With Colgate, who knows what they're putting in there? You know what I mean? Like,
fair enough. But that's not based on what I tell you about myself. That's based on us spending time together,
right? Sure.
And getting familiar with our complexities. Right? If you were to hang out at a Colgate headquarters, you'd probably get a pretty good idea about how they're not doing what you want them to do.
Right. Yeah. Which is something I do. And I recommend that everyone, at least now and then,
go down at your local Colgates. They'll let you in. It's worth it.
I think there's one in every city now, these Colgate places.
Another piece of that,
yeah,
which is I make this argument for spirituality as the excess immersion of integration of subjective subsystems. So let's say there's something to that, or at the very least, there's some numinous excessive surplus quality of supersalience, right? And if an individual is able to access supersalience for themselves and can share a little bit of it with others, that can be incredibly charismatic. And it can be charismatic in areas where it doesn't necessarily apply. And it's not just a spiritual thing, right? Somebody could be just fantastic at coordinating all the parts of their body in a gymnastics routine. And then they say to you, yeah, I'm off milk. And you're like, wow, maybe I should get off milk. Because when he said it, I just really felt it was vibrantly true. Does he know anything about milk? Well, no, but he's awesome at gymnastics. He's got a glow. So that problem of the glow, which is the very thing we're trying to work on in spirituality from a certain angle, is a thing that you have to critically unpack as it applies to different areas of your life, right? So if I can produce a bunch of additional existential satisfaction, I have to be careful to not assume that's an optimistic reading of the world. Like, how do you think the future is going to be? I feel great, so I think it's all going to work out. It may not work out just because I feel great. Those may be different things. Likewise, a person may be able to access a lot of this excess existential quality, and what they want to tell you about your personal life is way off. So there is an element of getting smarter about how we communicate and receive communication relative to sort of an excess charm.
Sure. Well, I'm curious too, though. I feel like one of the things that integral theory does really well, and even explicitly so, especially in like integral spirituality, is naming these different dynamics, right? Is naming this dynamic that we're talking about, that, you can sit on the meditation mat, for 20 years and not know anything about, developmental stages and vice versa, right? Naming these different lines and that sort of a thing. So in some ways you could argue that what kind of integral theory offers is it differentiates a bit in meaningful ways for people when you're thinking about what spirituality is. Like once you're aware of, okay, we've broken off, there's this thing about the shadow, and there's certain psychological work that we need to do, and that is important. There's this sort of interpersonal element that's different from this kind of just pure spirituality thing. You can start to differentiate these different lines. I guess the question is sort of how much more of that do we still need to be doing, right? Because clearly, even with all of that, didn't really fully work for a lot of folks, right? And so it seems like it, is it just that we might have these maps, but we're not using them effectively, or we're not paying them attention enough, we're not really taking them to heart, or is there something in the map that's missing still?
It's a great question, and it's got to be a bit of both, right? We can make a better map. It's not like what we've discovered so far is the Hegelian end of time, right? There's a next layer of this that we have to get to. And that next layer is not only going to be descriptively better, it's going to be prescriptively better at allowing people to behave in ways that are more successful. Now, we have to be careful because you hear from people who think it didn't work. You don't necessarily hear from people who it really improved things in. So we got to balance that out carefully. Actually, we were talking to Daniel Gortz the other day, and he brought up the Andrew Cohen thing as an example of remembering integral as successful, which is to say, here's a situation where you have a kind of traditional authoritarian scheme, and you have a guy who buys into because I'm accessing something amazing, I get to push your boundaries because you're here to transcend yourself. And so I know better about you than you do, right? And he's backtracked on that a little bit. To me, it looks like he's grown, but you never know. I described him as potentially a hipster sociopath the first time I talked to him. So you can't really get a total read on someone. But in that situation, and this is what made it kind of laudable, was there was an integral discussion, and the top students could go to him and say, this isn't working for us anymore. And he could say, I respect you guys. I think I'm doing the right thing. I don't really see what you're saying, but I'm willing to step down and go and think about this. Right. And you're like, well, that's remarkable. That didn't happen with Adi Da. That didn't happen with Ramakrishna. That didn't happen with St. Paul. Right. So there's something new about the operating system we already have that can make these things a little smoother and better. It's not going to fix everything, but you can already see ways that it might make things better, and that an even better model could do even more of that. So I think we need to be open to the idea that there has been growth and there has been success, and these things have been pretty successful, and a lot of we just haven't assimilated or used it as much as we have, and where it has been used, it's worked to some degree.
Yeah, and of course, you never know what never happened because maybe people have these sorts of tools. I will say I do appreciate Daniel Gortz and the whole Hansi thing because it's so, throughout the Hansi works, there's sort of this recurring leitmotif, joke about, hey, watch out for the cult leader who's going to, be all developed and then sleep with your wife, right? So it's a very self-aware sort of thing. And I think the more self-awareness that we have around these things, the better, personally. So, and for my part, I would hope that people could understand that my saying that and where I'm coming from, by trying to emphasize that, is I don't perceive as a cancellation effect. I'm not trying to cancel anyone. For me, it's about, these are really dangerous dynamics and they've done a lot of harm. So the more people know about them, the more we're kind of hyper vigilant about this sort of thing, the better, would be my general take on it. But
yeah, and that gets around this. This sort of critical and opposed or affirmatively naive position, right? So when you provide something, or when I sit down and talk to somebody, that's not a blanket affirmation of what they're doing. Likewise, when you're like, hey, there are these concerns, that's not a blanket attack either, right? We're not in that kind of discourse space. We're assuming we've got to give each other the benefit of the doubt for having a complex, nuanced backdrop to the points we're trying to make.
Well said. Any final areas you'd like to explore about an hour and a half?
Two things are on my mind.
Sure.
One is languaging. So this is another question I brought up in a lot of the spiritual transmission series stuff, which is, are the words we use a little bit contaminated or distorting because they're embedded in an earlier social model, right? So if we're talking about something that the transmitter and the student are going to do together, that could be considered to be a mutual form of participatory engagement. It doesn't necessarily require words like surrender, sacrifice, or master, right? Or devotee or disciple. There are ways to understand those positively. There are ways to understand that they are fraught with dangers of various kinds. They certainly lean into a certain social ethos and an unnecessary hierarchical opportunity for manipulation. We might be able to say it's very different. Like, let's engage in the mutual co-participatory enactment of satsang, rather than I overcome myself and my stupid ego and you master me, right? So different wording and new languaging might be able to take it in a healthier, more stable direction for something that's at the level of the social expectations we have today.
Well, yeah, quick thought on that though, and I find this to be really another thorny issue, which is it's not just language, because the language is also communicating concepts. And so is there something in, how do I put this? Let's say, is there something fundamentally different, right, between the orientation that I have, the kind of background suppositions and way I carry myself, way I buy into a situation, you know, is all that changed by using different words, right? If I'm entering a space and saying, okay, now I'm going to co-creatively do this thing with this other person, right? Maybe I've lost that kind of a certain naivete, right? Which is really, this is what I'm really getting at, is that do certain forms of spirituality require a certain kind of naivete, which once that's gone, render those potential forms no longer possible, or only by extreme effort somehow getting back there?
I think the key thing is to establish a space in which people have the flexible opportunity to explore these things, and that they can check that against their own autonomy, and they can check their willingness to transcend themselves against their autonomy as well, right? Like, if my girlfriend says, hey, slap me and call me a bitch, that's a little bit different than spousal abuse, right? Right, but it's a specific thing, right? The fact that she can say yes or no, the fact that we're going to create it in a performative context now, we go, hey, in this circumstance, based on the fact that everybody's got autonomy here and we trust each other to be careful, we're going to lean into the very evocative, naively charged terminology to see if we can get a particular effect in a particular circumstance. That's very different than a blanket affirmation of these phenomena. Right. So I think you can set up and go, hey, okay, we're going to do, because there's something to go like, I'm going to completely surrender to the Lord. Okay, there's something I'm going to get out of that. I'm not going to be carefully parse out some kind of alternative phrasing, but it's the space of understanding. It's the metacognitive space in which I could parse out that better phrasing that affords me the opportunity to lean into the surrender model with a sincere ironic background rather than just getting trapped in it.
No, and I agree. And I would say whatever can do that is effectively creating a metamodern context for this sort of work. My lingering question, though, is, are there certain things that background metacognitive awareness renders then impossible? Almost by definition, right? Certain forms of naivete or kind of single entendre, simplistic one-on-one, assumptions about what's going on are going to be rendered no longer.
I would say this. I would say generally no, which is, I don't think we know the limit of what the metacognitive, sincerely ironic adjacency space is capable of. I think it's way more capable than we fear it might be, right? I make the absolute in quotes. It's actually better than the absolute without quotes, right? And there's ways to do the transvaluation that aren't limited by this. And we don't know how far that can go. I think it can go really far, maybe farther than anybody thinks. However, there are some situations that may or may not be desirable, that involve an absolute overload. I mentioned Carter Phipps earlier because he and I had discussed this handbook a couple of years ago. And when I interviewed him on the Spiritual Transmission series, he suggested the possibility that the people we think of as the great realizers are kind of broken, that that's not the normal way to go through this process, right? That there's something imbalanced about their brains and they lean all the way into this phenomenon and it overloads them and they're like clicked into this mode for the rest of their life now. They broke something inside. It's like they maybe benevolently got abused and traumatized, and now they're going to suffer that trauma forever. And we can use them to do something for us if we're careful, but that's not necessarily how a healthy, well-balanced human being would go through that process.
Right, which then also again reminds me, well, one, it reminds me of that, I think it's attributed to Rumi of, the break is what lets the light in or something like that. So if someone's really broken, they're letting a lot of light in potentially. It depends on how they're broken. But no, it makes me go back to what we were saying earlier about, if you're trying to, with the guru relationship, if you have a projected ideal of some kind or some image that is allowing you to realize your full potential, so-called, what does that look like? Does it look like someone who's broken and is leaning into that? Or does it look like I am a very well-adjusted human being and I'm doing very well, thank you. And I don't need to sit on a lofty throne or anything. I'm very happy to just break bread with my friends, whatever. So it's an interesting how we idealize these things. And by idealizing, sort of the holy fool or in some ways this gets into the shaman as well, very much, right? I mean, there's the deep connection between connection with divinity, madness, being a social outcast and having a special power and all these sorts of things. So it's interesting.
We're dealing with mutants here.
Yeah.
And you have to be cautious about that. And part of it is, you alluded to this a little bit earlier in terms of your own experience, which is a lot of this is theoretical for you, right? And this discussion is theoretical. And we don't necessarily know the answers. What's going to work best for you and what are you actually looking for? You may not know that until you go. I did this for years. You just go and sit with people and see what happens. Are they going to transmit something to you? Are you making it up? Are they making it up? Is it really happening? Okay, well, then go to the next guy. What happens if he zaps you, right? And there's a lot of risk. I thought I could handle it. Seemed like it worked out okay for me. It's not going to be the case for everyone, but that experimentation is a whole different level of this than theorizing.
Yeah.
Because right? You may not know. You may sit around some guy and you're like, just looks like some frumpy dude at a bus stop, but this is the kind of illumination I'm looking for. Or it may turn out you're like, it doesn't really work for me unless I see him on a golden throne.
Sure. No, that's true. But this is making my own experiences click in an interesting way. What we were talking about earlier about, if it's not psychological and it's not morally absolutistically related, it's more akin to sort of there's this force, other stuff going on, let's say, and you don't need to be right. You don't need to be good to be able to channel that, essentially. Because one of the very interesting experiences that I had, we talked about this I think in our first conversation briefly, but when I was a kid in an evangelical context, being slain in the spirit, baptized by the Holy Spirit, and you fall over and everything. That was a very that happened. That was an objective thing that I experienced. Yeah. And then, of course, I think those sorts of experiences lead then people to wonder, well, that power was there. That must mean that the whole thing is right. And I know a lot of people got caught up in this. My family dealt a lot with these dynamics where there's this thing going on. Actually, you might even have heard about the renewal because it was a Canadian phenomenon originally, right? A bunch of people speaking in tongues, churches going crazy. Everyone's, there's just like this, the spirit's moving kind of a thing. And it wound up, hurting a lot of people as well, because it was sort of like, oh, okay, well, if this is where the power of God is, then whatever's happening here must also then be right and true and all these other things. It's like, well, what if we can separate those two? What if the power of God, so-called, can be flowing here in intense ways, and that has nothing to do with the theology or the pastor? You can even think about Benny Hinn and all that stuff. Remember zapping people going like this and they all fall over? It's hard to know how much of that was real, but even if not all of it was fake, let's say, something's happening there. And of course, Benny Hinn was a seriously problematic figure. So it's a very interesting thing when you begin to divorce these ideas of that kind of spiritual raw power, or however you want to think about that, and these moral and psychological elements.
I'd like to touch on the divorce and the opposite of that, the convergence, right? So the divorce thing is absolutely essential. And this is one of the gifts of the Ken Wilber type of expression, that we should all basically have a model where we can try to separate these things out and put them in different areas. So they're not just, we're not conflating them all into one, whether positively or negatively, but B, we're doing the thing that a lot of the traditions have built-in wisdom about, which is not getting carried away with the siddhis, right? If amazing stuff happens, that's not the same as your wisdom development, just like states are not the same as stages. The fact the amazing thing happens doesn't mean this is God's special land. It may just be amazing things happening. And we need to be able to tease those apart. On the other hand, there's a point beyond which we don't want to do too much teasing, because there's a real value in keeping power, enlightenment, and goodness close together, right? And they're not going to be the same, or then they're not going to be equal in all cases. And if you had to choose one over the other, people would make different choices. But we do have to think about how goodness can be put at the center of the project, right? And you go, yes, maybe this is a mutant specialization where a person can zap me with some kind of consciousness and subtle energy power. And I'm playing a subjective role in that, and I'm not totally sure what that role is. And it might just be a freak capacity that I want to have access to. But going forward, looking at what's happening to civilization and what we want for people and what we want for ourselves, we would really like that to skew toward goodness.
Yeah.
And we don't know a lot about how goodness is developed, right? What we know a lot about is people can say they're good, or we can think they're good, and it turns out they aren't. We know we can lecture each other on how to be good, but we aren't totally right. We can pose ethical experiments to college students, and they can imagine whether or not they push a fat guy in front of a train. But our actual schemes for inculcating moral intelligence, not that great. Right. So we need to be seriously thinking, as part of metamodern spirituality and integral theory and everything else, what is actionable about building goodness?
It's funny, actually. I never knew that that's what those tests were about. I realize why I did so poorly on them now. Morality. They were testing morality. Oh, okay. No, this is really interesting and really helpful too, because I've been wrestling a lot with this issue where I want to conflate the goodness with the spiritual thing. Like, that to me seems really important. And so when I keep seeing people who are talking about so much about that, the emphasis, well, I guess to lay it out, right? Like, some people will say that what is spirituality about? It's about waking up. It's about achieving a state experience of non-duality. And if you're not doing that, you're not really doing spirituality, are you? I think that that's a really important element. But if those people do that and achieve non-dual awareness and then, go, beat up their grandmother, I'm not going to, that they're not going to land for me as a spiritual person. And so I think what we need to consider spirituality as comprising is more than just any one of these things, I suppose, too, right? Because you can also be a really good person and not have any spiritual inclinations. And so it starts to feel like there's this sort of cord, or this knot of different lines coming together into kind of a whole that you can say collectively, that there's something here. And I don't know, I guess to turn that into a question, I mean, if someone were to articulate spirituality as being about achieving non-dual awakening, would you say yes and, or would you say yes, that's a totally valid description of spirituality, or vice versa, right? Because the Christian tradition doesn't emphasize that hardly as much, if at all. And it's much more about how you act towards your neighbor. Do you love God? Do you pray? And these sorts of things, right? It's much more ethically, I think, oriented. Not to say that obviously that the Eastern traditions aren't ethically oriented. They obviously are. But I mean that there's, it's not part of the practice, right? You go to church and you're not going to learn about, how, or talk about how's your contemplation practice going or anything like that, right? Are you closer to achieving the unia mystica? It's just not part of Christian praxis. And yet, yeah, you go to confession, you go to you pray for forgiveness, that sort of thing. So anyway, for me, these are really important elements of a spiritual practice that, in my mind, yes, to your point, need to be brought together, but also appreciably teased apart, so we're not conflating them as necessarily the same thing. So yeah.
It's interesting. I would say that non-duality is, and I'm very specific in my use of non-duality, right? There's a lot of unitive states of consciousness that I would not describe as non-dual. I would say that non-duality is the supreme adjunct specialization to spirituality, but not the core of the process. It's a unique, intense variant of the process. The process is really about generating beingness and growth through this blending and hybridization of subsystems so that you're more real, you're more of what you are. John Vervaeke uses this term autonormativity, which is very like it's so real it's good, or it's so good that it's really real. There's something like that, right? You can appreciate in a moment of heightened perception that just to behold the isness of something is a kind of goodness, but it's far from the only kind of goodness. And it may be, I would argue that it is an artifact of a synthesis of sub-processes, and that we can do that synthesis in a variety of areas, and they will all start to have their own kind of goodness. And we need to become more skilled, have a better social wisdom and discussion around how to increase and weave together those different forms of goodness. And one special variant of that, which if you can only do one, do the non-dual one. But generally speaking, you don't have to only do one.
Would you say that though? Because I would incline differently. If you could only do one, right? I would opt more for the goodness. I'd much rather
the
meet.
Thing is the time differential is how I would mitigate that, right? So goodness is the part where you don't necessarily do the one, because goodness is you're committed to a life of transformational growth in various areas. If you're going to be murdered later today and you know about it, then non-duality is where you want to get to, because it pre-solves all conundrums. So if that's all you can do, then do that. That's much better than spending that time trying to escape into your astral body or trying to get 3 hours worth of self-development in. It's probably not going to do much for you.
Though arguably 3 hours of meditation towards reaching non-dual awareness might not accomplish as much either. But
no, I would strongly recommend 3 hours of intense Cohen practice.
Though it's interesting, though, you say it pre-solves all the problems. And again, I feel like, isn't that sort of problematic though? Because that would suggest that if then you have had the non-dual awareness, then you should have resolved all of your interpersonal issues and et cetera, right? There does seem to be a meaningful disconnect.
There's a semantic issue here, right? And
yeah.
I say pre-solves, and I'm pointing at something subjective. You're accessing a dimension of yourself or a capacity of the self, which before you encounter the conundrum quality of anything that you can contemplate, it already has the experience of having been resolved. That doesn't mean from the outside, because you haven't solved all problems. You've pre-solved all problems. They still exist and have exactly the same form they had before.
See, I'm starting to realize why I did so poorly in school, because this is how I solved my math problems. I just pre-solved them. I left them as they were, but I said, look, they're pre-solved. Look, so
pre-solved.
Yeah.
Here's a blank piece of paper.
Between my math and my morality classes, I was a bad student. Very
numbers divided by infinity have the same quantity, man.
You earlier mentioned that there were two things that you also wanted to talk about. One was languaging, and I don't know if we've sufficiently moved ground since then that maybe you've lost the thread on that one, but I wanted to give you a chance to bring that up again if you wanted to touch on that additional thing, the second thing.
I don't have too much to add. I would just ask people whether they are being teachers or being students or just interested in the phenomenon to examine their own assumptions about the terminology, because the fact that there's a practice and a participation that you can go through that suggests to you you might be able to achieve some kind of existential religious, spiritual, or transformative experience, that doesn't mean the way you're phrasing it to yourself or the way everyone in the community is talking about it is necessarily the way it needs to be discussed. And we know that, with postmodern and post-postmodern awareness, there are a lot of hidden assumptions built into our terminology choices. That doesn't mean they're wrong. There may be times where it's perfectly appropriate to use those, where it's perfectly appropriate to use the distorted assumption, or perfectly appropriate to use it and assume there's no necessary distortion, that you can use it cleaned up. Like I was saying about the way Nietzsche talks, you clean your ears when you're taking the word in. Nonetheless, we do have to ask ourselves whether the implication of the terminology is necessary or unnecessary, right? If the terminology is unnecessary and you could say it a different way, then ask yourself what that way would be like. And it's a way of clarifying for yourself what you think the project is. Because if the only thing you can think of to say is, I surrender to my guru, then you're going to have a hard time telling the difference between when that's an effective and an ineffective act for you to be a participant in. But if you have some other more sophisticated way of saying, look, we're co-participating in this, I'm going to do this, I'm aware of it, right? If you have a different phraseology, maybe it's clumsier and not as sexy for you, fine. But as long as you at least have that option open, then you can ask yourself whether you're falling into the implications of the terms or not. And then maybe you can do the practice without any of those implications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, also just in terms of the limits of language and whatnot, and what we're talking about, or we're just talking about a second ago, the word spiritual itself, I think, is a wiggly one. Where given that there are these multiple elements to a spiritual practice, right? I think this is in some ways sort of the crux of the issue. When I would see some of these things get shared about Andrew Cohen or this or that, it would sort of be like, well, wait a second, Andrew Cohen did a mean thing and he was a bad, he didn't do the good thing. Yeah. So therefore that's not spiritual. But another person could say, oh, but what about that crazy non-dual, collective consciousness thing we all experienced, et cetera? Then it's sort of like, well, that is the spiritual thing. And so a word like spiritual, depending on how you are defining that and what falls into that category and whatnot, you can be leaving out of your sort of field of vision things that are all part of that legitimately, but might seem antagonistic. And that's what's so challenging for me, is sort of, which actually, to frame this as a question, would you say that in the context of, like, let's say you can only do one, or talking about parsing these things, and some people might be more gifted at let's say the non-dual thing, or the consciousness expansion thing, than the this or that. What I would say, and I want to know if you would agree with this or disagree, and why, is that if you're really going to think about spiritual, kind of capital S, like what it's all about, wouldn't it be great if all those things were together, right? If you were to think about, let's say there's a spiritual organization and there's someone at the head of it, are you going to want that person at the head of it to be just the person who has the great non-dual awareness thing going on, but is actually really mean to people and maybe abusive and that sort of thing? Or if you could kind of choose, right? Like, how would you choose? And it seems like the ideal would be the spiritual ideal would be all of the above, right? The person's good, they're ethical, they're moral, they don't traumatize people. They've also have deep state experiences and this and that. And that if you're going to think about what is spiritual and what is that about, it should be sort of the ultimate blend of all of those. Would you agree or disagree with that formulation?
In principle, sure. And it's a big ask, and you also don't want to constrain the experimental freedom of people to try it in different ways and take risks by trying to mandate some kind of top-down integration of all the parts. But the more parts you have in play, the better. And I think when it spreads beyond an individual to a community, one of the opportunities you have is to try to set that community up as a mandala where people stand in for different things. You say, well, okay, this guy, maybe we're going to put him at the center like he's the queen bee, and we're just going to go and suck royal jelly off him or something like that. Okay. But we also need to eat, and we need to eat healthy, right? We need to exercise. We need to be good to each other. And it may be that different people in the community can take those roles on. And if you have a balanced community, people can do that, because you can't expect one person to specialize in all of it perfectly. So if we want to move toward a more integrated convergence of all these things, we've got to be thinking about how to do that together with each other. But also, like I said, still holding space for risky anarchic experiments, right? Maybe people won't need free zones. They need hinterlands and wastelands and frontiers where they just try scary, risky stuff. And sometimes that's going to go wrong, but it has to at least be an option. That said, I personally make a distinction between spirituality and mysticism, right? And mysticism in terms of the basic states, right? So you want to dispense with your physical body and just live in the dream realm, then you're a subtle mystic. If you want to say, hey, there's nothing but materiality, you're a gross realm mystic. If you want to say, hey, let's just focus on pure experience, or let's just focus on non-duality, great. And you could be an adept specialist in that area. But that's not what I would call spirituality. I would call spirituality, in that case, a mixing and a blending and a oscillating back and forth, a circulation between those that builds up some shared coherence between them that powers your own unfolding growth.
Well said. My friend, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here, but this was really,
we certainly have. It's been very nice to be a guest on the Integral Stage.
Yes, well, the Integral Stage is glad to have you. You've done so much for the Integral Stage that we appreciate it.
I hope you feel like the kinds of concerns that led you into your responses have been, at least plausibly addressed or heard anyway.
Very much so, at multiple levels, both, in specific and general ways. And then also I felt like this was a really personally fruitful kind of exploration of these issues that helps me make better sense of these particular dynamics. And so yeah, all the above. I thought it was great, and gives me a lot to continue to chew on and to think about. So yeah, and I guess, speaking for the Integral Stage, I will just say what a great job we at the Integral Stage are doing to bring many voices to the community and explore all the different parts, and to do so with integrity. So
you guys are doing a great job. Someone should be paying you for it, and I think you should get to sleep with your viewers.
On that, good night and good luck, everybody.